Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and change makers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our series exploring COVID-19's impact on nonprofits and small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area. Back in April of 2020, when we decided to create this ongoing series on COVID-19's impact, first on nonprofits and then on small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, we, like you, had no idea how long the pandemic would go on and what the health and economic impact would be in our community. With vaccinations increasing, COVID-19 cases and deaths decreasing, we're now moving into the summer of 2021 with the reopening of the economy and all of the uncertainty of our ever-changing indoor and outdoor, vaccinated and unvaccinated protocols, and the politics that will drive how we all come back together as a unified or fractured community. We will continue to shine a spotlight on the nonprofits and small businesses that make up the fabric of our community, along with the founders and staff who are struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, services, and sustainability until we can all get to the other side of the pandemic. Along the way, we will also share with you all the amazing solutions that our nonprofits, small businesses, foundations, and government leaders are working on to help us all get to the other side of the pandemic and come together to rebuild our communities with more economic, social, and environmental equality.
And when the private equity money comes in, that's when, unfortunately, you see the human equity and the cultural equity and the racial equity tends to disappear. Suddenly, it's equitable only for the people that have brought the billions of dollars to play. And unfortunately, we have incredibly grave global scale societal issues to resolve. And those are only resolvable if it's actually being equitable for everyone, whether you're Black, brown, Asian, white, private equity baron, or a carpenter. Like, you've got to be able to be getting by and not be displaced.
With the health and financial impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and a low inventory of housing, especially live, work, and warehouse space, the focus of this week's episode is on housing for our artist community members. Our featured voices are the Executive Consultant for Vital Arts, Catherine Reasoner, and Executive Director of the Northern California Land Trust, Ian Winters, who share about their work with our artists community to develop solutions to deal with the pandemic's ongoing impact on their housing.
I'm joined remotely by Executive Consultant Catherine Reasoner of Vital Arts and the Executive Director of the Northern California Community Land Trust, Ian Winters. Thanks for being here, Catherine and Ian.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, George.
So I'd like to begin by having each of you provide a little background on each of your organizations. So Catherine, why don't we start with Vital Arts, and then we'll move over to the Northern California Community Land Trust.
Thank you. Vital Arts was founded out of the tragedy of the Ghost Ship Fire. Edward Burr Brown lost his son Jonathan the night of the fire, and with two of his good friends, Beth Jay and Tom Dolan, founded Vital Arts to honor the memory of those lost in the fire by ensuring access to safe, affordable spaces for artists to live, work, and perform. We act as an advocate, facilitator, and catalyst for solutions and seeking systemic change in the way artists housing, and work and performance space are dealt with in the Bay Area. And we work very flexibly in collaboration with others, but we are a constant presence and have been for several years.
And Catherine, one of your main programs is the Opportunity Loan Fund.
Yeah, we work in three areas. All are sort of based on stemming displacement of artists. The first one was we spent a lot of time looking at the needs of existing live workspaces and analyzing what the barriers were. And one of the things we found, of course, access to capital is often an issue, but we found that with existing live workspaces, particularly in Oakland, where we estimate there's about 200 that are under the radar, access to sometimes even modest amounts of capital to get an engineering study done or to help with soft cost pre-construction to address code issues can doom or really threaten an entire, ecosystem of artists living and working in the space. So the Opportunity Loan Fund is a small, sort of modest revolving fund that provides capital for particular projects to take advantage of specific opportunities that might allow them to leverage greater sustainability. We also, at this moment, working on 3 or 4 different projects. We've been working a lot on code and zoning issues that are in the way and addressing advocacy with public officials, like, for example, in the city of Berkeley, which just passed a lot of funding for affordable housing. Artists were not included in the housing guidelines or even in the language that would have permitted that. So getting artists written in as a priority endangered group, along with teachers and firefighters, as we did in the city of Berkeley, but also getting codes and zoning to address non-traditional housing, such as live work, can have real big dividends. And we've gotten one development now will include 3 artist units in new construction in an affordable housing development in Berkeley as a result of some of that early advocacy. So we're working at both ends, trying to preserve and trying to get new housing developed.
And Catherine, how does Vital Arts work with Ian and the Northern California Community Land Trust?
I should let Ian speak to that, but we're working on a couple of levels. Vital Arts does work through collaboration with others. We know that there are a lot of other agencies that have been doing this work a lot longer than we have, specifically when it comes to things like housing. Very complicated to understand that landscape. And so Northern California Community Land Trust is a really trusted partner because not only do they know the landscape and what some of the challenges on the ground, but they have fostered and seeded several other land trusts and other entities in the area. And Ian himself is a practicing artist and doesn't need us to explain to him what artist live work housing looks like and how unusual it is. So we've been working with them more recently on the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. We can talk more about that. Ian invited us to do outreach specifically to artists to make sure that artists are aware that the state has put aside $1.5 billion, soon to be $3 billion in rental relief, which is now being matched by the feds. We're finding that arts institutions, even at the city level, don't know about this, that the arts community has completely been left out of the communications. It's been very exciting to do that outreach because artists, as many of us know, and we can talk about, are among the hardest hit in unemployment since COVID, and the need is very great. We're also hoping to develop a program that will sort of focus on deed restrictions to existing property that are occupied by artists to ensure that they are permanently restricted for artists' use in the future. And we're looking at different strategies to do that.
Thank you. And turning to you, Ian, can you walk us through all of the wonderful programs? You guys are policy advocates. You have your own housing. You have commercial. You're doing co-ownership. Lots of great stuff.
Yeah, well, I can try to touch on some things. Above all, so NCLT was founded in 1970 with an incredibly broad mandate that in some ways it's inspiring and at the same time the type of broad mandate that up until this year, I would say you wouldn't have been able to charter an organization. That our original purpose was set up to found and spread the CLT model across Northern California and create a transformative new approach to real estate ownership and equality and this amazing array of things. We started out very small, and our first urban project was in South Berkeley. It was our office building, which housed the East Bay Community Law Center originally, our offices, and the Long Haul Info Shop, and just a host of progressive organizations over the years. And that was the mid-'80s, and we've been slowly growing since then. The last 3 years, we've actually been growing quite rapidly. So our focuses have been and continue to be what we call the Community Co-Ownership Initiative, which is an education program in partnership with the People of Color Sustainable Housing Network that is intended to really transform how do really different communities think about what's broadly construed as cooperative ownership. But legally means there's lots of different sub-variations of it that are best for particular projects. But what we're trying to do is educate people to be able to help themselves and think about how do you come together with your immediate community to take control of your housing, take control of your workspace, and make that permanently affordable so that you both have ownership control and you're not setting something up where it works great for you, but if whenever you decide to leave for whatever reason, whether it's 10 years from now or 100 years from now, you're not making it impossible for anyone else to do what you did. So that's an education program, training program, and outreach program that we're really excited about. Then there's our straightforward housing development and acquisition and rehab projects, where another key thing that we all face is displacement. The racial makeup of the Bay Area's communities has been changing, and not for the better. Like, a huge percentage of our Black and Brown community in Berkeley and Oakland has been displaced in the last decade and is happening at an escalating rate. The anti-displacement projects are where we go in, typically work with tenant organizing groups and resident groups to identify buildings, like we did 10th Street in Berkeley. It's a project we recently did where the owner had set up the building for what's called repositioning, which in less banal language means it's going to be sold to hedge fund investors who will effectively evict everyone or convince everyone to leave so that the rents can be spiked. And it doesn't really matter what the rent laws are. The investment organizations have a way of winning. So what we've been able to do, again, with Measure O in Berkeley helped us on one project, Measure KK in Oakland, and various other regional financing initiatives have let us be able to come in, buy a building from the market that is in the midst of this, and start stabilizing the building, identify rehab that needs to be done, and eventually make it so it remains permanently affordable.
So following up on that, how has COVID-19 impacted the Northern California Land Trust's activities to try to secure housing?
It's made it all incredibly complicated. A lot of our work is actually not necessarily best suited to do remotely. It involves real buildings, real people, and often in communities that don't have wonderful internet access. So it's been a tough year. And it's also been a tough year for a lot of our projects, which largely have a great deal of autonomy. So when a building is completed, typically the residents own the improvements. Not always, but in many cases, and manage the sort of day-to-day things. And a lot of projects have had a really hard time where they've seen 30, 40, 50% of their residents suddenly completely unemployed at the same time as have buildings that are not huge buildings, and everyone is cooped up there 24/7 for months. And that gets hard. Our dispute resolution and mediation folks have been busy this year. It's also led into the work that we're doing with Catherine and a bunch of other CLTs in the Bay Area, and the Berkeley Tenants Union really drove being part of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. When the state put out that call, was knowing how really hard hit so many of our residents were. Our goal initially was just to make sure that our residents got help. And then you start getting into it and go, wow, okay, our residents are really hard hit, but that's dwarfed by the need across the state. It's really, a lot of people don't have all the paperwork to hand that the state and the local applications ask for, and really need a helping hand to kind of make sure things happen. And just the encouragement to go, yes, like there is help there. It's real help. It's not, there's a lot of distrust of government agencies still. A lot of people are like, is that really intended to help me? Or is this something like, what's the secret story behind it? Where's the bad lining to it? And it's been satisfying to see our team be able to help a lot of people. Last week, we passed the 600th in-person and or one-on-one sort of direct assistance in the last 6 weeks. So that's 600 households there.
That's great. So I'm going to turn to my next question and start with you, Catherine. What are you seeing as some of the biggest issues facing artists in housing and in workspace?
Well, of course, the issue always for artists in finding housing or any other kind of space is affordability in the Bay Area. That's been an issue for quite some time. But I began working on this issue back a long time ago in the city of San Francisco when we were doing the first cultural element in a city master plan. And one of the things that we realize is live work in particular. A lot of artists, it's not enough to have a conventional housing unit. They need that workspace, and to have non-traditional space where you can do welding or you can make loud noise with your saxophone at night or whatever is a particular type of space that artists need that often is in short supply. So the biggest issue that we've seen is affordability, but then zoning and codes as they're currently written and have been for some time can really create a big barrier, because a lot of the housing that artists need is non-conforming with existing codes, particularly residential code. In San Francisco, we succeeded in redoing and doing the first interpretation of the Uniform Building Code to create a live-work code that was predominantly commercial in nature, predominantly work, and a certain percentage of live. That was unfortunately used during that era. This was the 80s to allow a lot of live work lifestyling units. But the city of Oakland just recently redid their code, put back in some of the stuff that they had stripped out recently, that they had pulled some of those things out, and it much harder for existing buildings and existing housing to qualify. We're at the point now where we're just trying to rescue or save housing that's been here for a long time that suddenly is seen as non-conforming because there's pressure from cannabis, there's pressure from developers, there's pressure from hedge funds. As Ian pointed out, this real estate is really valuable. So I'd say first, affordability. Second, the zoning and codes. The third has to do with access to the capital and expertise. One of the things that we found is we started touring buildings, and we work a lot with Safer Spaces DIY, which has worked directly with 100 spaces in Oakland to stabilize them. We learn about spaces that are trying to stay below the radar, that are having problems coming into compliance, and speak with them. And as I was saying, some of the populations that we work with the rental assistance program don't trust the government and don't know how to prepare an application. Multiply that for artists that don't trust the government, have not had good experiences with inspectors, and also don't have the expertise sometimes to access the capital or access the professional assistance they would need to bringing a building to code. So it all comes down to access, which I think is true about a lot of marginalized populations in our society. With some of these live work buildings, it can get a little bit more complicated because the type of housing that they're in is so non-traditional that there's a whole lot of merry-go-round that they get on trying to just get it, basically. But I think that's what I see as one of the biggest systemic issues, is that we've got to address the capital. We've also got to address the codes. And then now building anything new is prohibitively expensive. So adaptive reuse becomes the solution. It has been for many cities. And here's where COVID has actually given us a gift, is that things are getting marginally more affordable and accessible in this situation. Although, as Ian pointed out, there's also sort of a land grab going on with certain people who are taking the long term and trying to get in there as well.
So, Ian, same question for you. I mean, you're on the ground with your team every day, not only building, but also managing as well. What do you feel are some of the big issues facing artists and our artist community with regards to housing and work-live spots?
So this issue of permanent affordability and creating structures that can steward buildings and keep them affordable really long term is really critical. Echoing Catherine on that. And there's also the stewardship piece. There are some communities that have been around. There's a huge explosion of sort of innovation and art spaces and things like that in the late 60s into the 70s and early 80s in San Francisco. One of the things as a affordable housing organization with a really long-term lens on things is looking at how do we help all of those groups sort of maintain their stewardship and maintain their viability as they go through. Because it's one thing to start an artist space when things are really cheap and everyone involved is 26. And then what happens 40 years down the road? How do you find the equitable way to balance? Oh, we've got this thing. Oh, but 3 out of 10 people are still active in the arts. 3 really actually want to exit out of it, and they're trying to retire somewhere else, but the only reason they haven't is because they don't want to undo this thing. And there starts to be lots of complicated thinking about how that happens and how at the same time we can create new spaces. How do we not lose a lot of the wonderful things that have been built in the Bay Area? And it shouldn't just be going, wow, you're an artist and you helped build something amazing, so therefore you should just yourself voluntarily walk away from a multi-million-dollar property gain. A lot of people do, but we've seen a lot of people wrestle with tough choices. I think there's also a big overlap for us in our work of helping build. So live workspaces are not necessarily just for what you would think of as the fine arts, but it crosses over a huge amount to working class, artisan, craftsperson, sort of small business kind of endeavors. So a lot of those spaces are also the kind of spaces that are perfect for, you're starting your small carpentry company, or you have a wood shop, or it used to be like the classic thing would be you have your little small business and you live upstairs from it. And how do we make those spaces where people can have affordable workspace that lets them develop a small business that can support their family and themselves in a reasonable amount of dignity, even if we are not living in a Tocquevillian paradise that never quite was. And many of those issues overlap a great deal with the arts community. And in fact, many of the same people, because certainly many of my friends in the arts are also in the trades or have a small business doing catering or do things where work and live space overlap.
Well, and it seems like housing is going, all real estate is going up. I mean, the pandemic appears to have really driven the real estate in a direction I think that most people perhaps didn't think. First, there was the idea that it was going to drop, but now it also appears like there's more scarcity. And to your point earlier, Ian, that there's lots of commercial equity money floating around the marketplace, and they've done an amazing job of going in and helping change the marketplace in a way that makes it unaffordable for so many people.
Yeah. And when the private equity money comes in, that's when, unfortunately, you see the human equity and the cultural equity and the racial equity tends to disappear. Suddenly, it's equitable only for the people that have brought the billions of dollars to play.
Right, exactly. Works for them.
It works for them. And unfortunately, we have incredibly grave global scale societal issues to resolve. And those are only resolvable if it's actually being equitable for everyone. Whether you're Black, brown, Asian, white, Southern Hemisphere, Northern Hemisphere, private equity baron, or a carpenter, like you've got to be able to be getting by and not be displaced.
Right.
This brings up something that we're working on in Berkeley that Ian and I are both part of, is looking at what somebody called the other day in one of our meetings a post-retail environment, that we're watching not only existing spaces get emptied out by COVID and changes how cities function and retail and commercial space, but even with new developers, we're asking them to build retail on the ground floor as a condition for putting in affordable housing or any kind of building. So we're looking at sort of developers would find it really helpful if they could put some affordable housing, live work on the ground floor and meet some of those affordable housing requirements with ground floor spaces to integrate into the housing they're building in places in the East Bay that we're working with. Yet we're also looking at the vacancy rate rising in cities, in prime areas, and space that's going for naught. So part of what we're talking to people about, and I'm having very interesting conversations with like Community Arts Stabilization Trust. CAST is working on a project in East Oakland where they're looking at a combination of affordable housing and live work pop-ups on the ground floor for neighborhood people with arts as an urban development core principle, or what East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is doing with their Esther's Orbit Room project down in West Oakland, where they want to put in different types of local serving businesses on the ground floor, artists, owners, and other creatives who are part of those businesses up above, and really start to work with structures. And as Ian said, a lot of this harkens back to the way cities used to function, but we are having to try and find new ways to repurpose or rethink all of our existing policies and structures. And unfortunately, the capitalists you're talking about, the hedge funds, there's still, the building industry is still about 10 years behind. People are still building structures that are not serving what society needs now, particularly in urban environments. So I think where, as often happens, we've got creative people in the Bay Area that are really piloting some very exciting solutions to contemporary issues that cut across multiple groups that are really good public policy, but we're having to do a lot of advocacy and convincing people that moving at a snail's pace to adopt some of these new things is not going to get us where we need to go.
And you just sort of see the scale. This past weekend, wearing my arts hat, working on a project with a dance company called Robert Moses Kin in San Francisco. So we're now suddenly have a little company residency in what was the Gap building. And so you kind of go, okay, what has happened when a company like the Gap can no longer afford to pay the rents in downtown San Francisco on Market Street? It's vacant, yet rents aren't falling, but that's a striking example to me. Here's one of the busiest street corners in San Francisco. Previously, one of the top dogs of global retail can't afford it. Yet here we are, as me as a video artist and Robert as a mid-sized dance company and choreographer. We're getting to use the space, which is great, but it's curious.
I'd like to turn to my next topic and have each of you share a story of what it's been like, perhaps one of your favorite stories of working with our artist community around housing, equity, etc. So I'm going to start with you, Catherine.
Okay. Well, my favorite story actually doesn't have to do with housing at all, although it is an organization that is looking at building housing and adding housing. But we began working with the group Moxie in Oakland, which is the largest remaining industrial art space in the Bay Area, for at least in the East Bay. A lot of the really large industrial buildings that housed artists and people who could make really huge things, like for Burning Man and so forth, are gone. They've been forced out by cannabis, they've been purchased, they've been rented or raised, and property turned over. Moxie is the last remaining one, and they were having difficulty. They were serving hundreds of artists around the Bay Area because they had a unique place where you could fabricate and make a lot of stuff, work with large steel, et cetera, and whole ecosystem of artists depended on this space. They suffered a fire a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, which wiped out some of their studio space. Someone who they had sublet to for a project did the sort of a classic beginner's mistake of bagging up some linseed oil after sanding some wood. And during the daytime, while people were there, a fireball tore through part of their building. They had all the safety procedures in place, and they were able to deal with the fire pretty quickly. But then suddenly they were on the verge of wondering whether they were going to have to just go under and give up, because, of course, waiting for the insurance company to reimburse so they could start rebuilding, so artists could move in, so they could start making money. And Moxie was a really interesting space because it was also an incubator space for small artist entrepreneurs. All of the artists occupying studios there were purchasing jointly some really amazing equipment, enormous laser cutters, CNC machines, sharing things and subletting, subjobbing, and subcontracting to each other for commercial work that was not only bringing money into them, but was employing other artists. And they were doing a range of projects, and it ranged from tech offices to small restaurants to artist fabrications. So we were approached, and even though we were focused on housing, we were told Moxie just really needs capital to get through the next 90 days or their history. So Vital Arts, through the Opportunity Loan, which we created, raised funds and gave them a short-term loan. It helps that one of their founders, Atticus Wolf, very savvy, was able to really meet with people that were involved with Vital Arts and put forward the business plan and explain the economics of their whole thing and how they really train and enable artists to make a living, which was very attractive to us, and that they were a long-term proposition. Literally the month we gave them the money, COVID hit. They had artists that were having difficulty paying rent. They were all over. But they immediately pivoted to making PPE. They got a large donation of plastics. They brought artists in that knew how to use their advanced laser cutter and all their stuff. They started delivering thousands and thousands of face shields to hospitals all over the Bay Area. At one point, Moxie was coordinating 700 artists in the Bay Area, and a number of other organizations, from Laney College's sculpture department to toy makers, working with groups that were distributing the PPE, and became like a hub. They employed artists. They found ways to raise money, employ artists. They had volunteers and paid people on the line creating this stuff. Gave people a sense of purpose, a way to gather in community, to work safely, and create something that society really needed at that moment. I was just on a site visit with our board there that last week. And the exciting thing is, because of Vital Arts investment and them getting through that really tough period, their landlord decided that he could go, instead of month to month, he's given them a 15-year lease. They now have plans to vastly increase the number of studios. They're bringing in giant containers. We saw on site, it's a wonderful model. They've restructured into 3 different entities. So they now have sort of a firewall between the fabrication and the holding company for the property. So the property can be tended to regardless. And they are looking at a much more sustainable, much more healthy long-term existence where they can not just survive, but thrive. And they've been very clear in saying to us, if it wasn't for that cash when we needed it, we wouldn't still be here. And it's been very rewarding to work with them. For me personally, to be able to stay in touch and see just the amazing, enormous amount of energy, community goodwill, and creativity that they put together, not only in taking care of the artists that were connected to their space, but taking care of the community around them. And they're still doing that type of thing, and they will go on. They are now talking and working in collaboration. It's premature to announce anything, but with other entities in the Bay Area, about creating a housing complex that would be complementary in the same neighborhood and extending their incubator model, because they are one of the few artist collectives I know that's been able to operate in providing artists with employment and with basically mentoring and training artists in small business and entrepreneurial methods. So that's been exciting to see.
Thank you. Really wonderful story of people using the proverbial pivot to survive and find new opportunities.
While serving the community, which I think is key.
Exactly. I mean, 700 plastic shields at the time that we needed them most.
Well, they were making 10,000 of these every 2 weeks.
Wow.
They coordinated 700 artists and makers, but the quantity, they ended up donating 1,000 to San Quentin. They got to the point where they were able to, they passed them out at the Black Lives Matter march for people. So they've always thought in this lateral way that I think a lot of artists do, which is not just what's good for us, but what's good for the system and the community that we're part of.
Nice message. And Ian, how about yourself? Favorite story?
Well, I mean, this is, I would say, closely related to specifically artist housing, but my just favorite story of like the last 8 weeks or so has been, we helped, and one of the ways of like, how do artists and communities, how do you acquire property and how do you preserve what's there and sort of counter the forces that are driving homelessness for artists and everyone else? And there's a case, it's now 12 weeks ago. We've been really involved in helping create a law last year that Nancy Skinner championed called SB 1079 that allows anyone who's a renter or a tenant in a building that's up to 4 units, if that building goes into foreclosure and is going to be auctioned off, normally you're just out of luck. And this law lets you, as a tenant, when the foreclosure comes, you're allowed to match whatever bid there is, whether it's the banks or some outside investor, and keep control of your housing. The catch is you have 45 days to come up with the cash. And if you're renting somewhere, you might not always have $600,000 or $700,000 in cash lying around on short notice. But that said, it's a pretty significant tool, and we piloted this actually with a ton of people from the Berkeley arts community. There's a Berkeley Unified teacher named Jocelyn Foreman who's living in a house in Pinole, and it went into foreclosure with a bunch of her colleagues, and the families that she helps in the school district all came together through the Berkeley Public Schools Fund and started raising money to help her make a bid on this house. And then they brought us in. And I mean, interestingly, it's sort of tied to the arts because many of the people involved that made it happen are the arts faculty for Berkeley Unified. There's so many overlaps. And it was an amazing story where in 2 weeks, we all collectively raised almost $700,000 to get her home and prevent someone who has helped as a community resource officer, has helped thousands of families from losing her own home. And it's a pretty inspiring story. There's now hopefully soon to be funding so that this can happen, not just in this one magical instance where there's this tremendous community, but with state funding and other kinds of funding so that there are lots of buildings that artists work in. So Catherine sort of alluded to the work we've been doing in Berkeley collectively, looking at all the retail vacancies. There's a huge number of buildings in San Pablo University that the retail space is vacant. While the building might not get foreclosed on because the underlying land is so valuable that it can be sold to be torn down and developed, there's a need for a tool to be able to bring those buildings back into use. And SB 1079 and some of the related funding, it's not just sort of Jocelyn's house and her corner of people, but like, how can this story be a catalyst for actually every little neighborhood has the same kind of thing where we should be able to bring that housing and workspace back into community control. And it is possible. Like, that's the exciting thing is once you do it once, even though it's hard, you've got a home that you can point to.
And I'm staying with you, and same question for Catherine as well. So folks who are listening to the show, how can they get engaged in supporting your work? I mean, obviously there's donation. Can people volunteer? Would people rallying behind the new piece of legislation with Skinner to help lobby for City of Berkeley, City of Oakland? I could tell you the City of San Francisco has massive amounts of retail space. You've noticed it yourself. How can folks get engaged?
Yes. Well, kind of all of those things. If you want to donate and you're able to do so, we take all most major forms of modern currency, not Bitcoin yet. And we've also been a tremendous number of our projects have come about through people doing planned giving and kind of long-term donations where a home becomes affordable housing after someone passes away or it gets donated to us. So that's one thing. And on the outreach side, the legislative piece of kind of the ideas in Berkeley are kind of going through efforts through the Arts Commission. But there is one thing you could do right now, which is this week, Senator Skinner is advocating for funding for SB 1079. And on the California Community Land Trust Network site, cacltnetwork.org, there's an SB 1079 letter that you can sign and send to the governor, and also sends a copy to Senator Skinner to let her know that you're in support of her efforts. That would help CLTs and housing all across California.
Great. And then can folks volunteer at this point? I mean, we're going to all come out of this tomorrow, but that's the 15th of June. Can folks who want to volunteer help in any way as well?
Yes, we certainly have many different areas that you could volunteer with. We have a small project committee that helps review projects, like expertise in building, construction, and finance. Like those kind of expertise are really welcome. If you know a lot about teaching and or filming, the Co-Ownership Initiative helps develop curriculum for creating your own cooperative or kind of community-owned real estate of different kind that we share with EB Prick, People of Color Sustainable Housing Network, and a whole bunch of other CLTs around the Bay Area. So those are ways you can volunteer.
That's great. And turning to you, Catherine, how can folks get engaged in helping Vital Arts?
I think there are two critical ways. We're very tiny. We have no staff. I'm an independent consultant that helps Vital Arts, and a very few hours is a volunteer board and advisory committee. So we're looking to grow and build those groups. So we are interested in that. What I can say right now is that we are accepting donations, which make possible time, energy, and some of the work that we do through the Opportunity Fund. You can learn about that on our website, which is www.vitalarts.org. You can donate. And also we've launched a new mailing list for advocacy purposes. As Ian said, we keep a mailing list. We're starting to be able to develop that as a tool for advocacy when we're working on something. We know, for example, that the city of Oakland is about to unveil a new downtown plan, which is going to have some critical set-asides for art and culture. They're going to need support for some of those ideas because it's going to put requirements on developers that they set aside space for artists and cultural organizations. So we're sort of at constantly advocacy, political pressure mode. So you could sign our mailing list, send us a donation to help with the work is great. And volunteering is specifically on our committees and our board. And we are looking for good candidates for those that can help us as well.
Thank you. So this is a final question for both of you, but what do you think are some of the good things that have come out of the pandemic that could support our artist housing, more engagement with arts and arts education?
Well, I tend to be a bit optimist anyway, but I think that the arts community has come together through the pandemic in a way that it hasn't been in a long time. When it started, I was on weekly meetings with all of the nonprofit groups in Berkeley, for example. Oakland Arts Group's meeting has been a lot more meetings, a lot more convenings. They were mostly Zoom, but bringing people together to talk about shared ideas. So collaboration is starting to be, it always was so difficult to do between a lot of entities. We're seeing a lot more collaboration and a lot more people working together because the bigger fight is not between the way we want to do things, the way you want to do things. It's the bigger threat to the arts as a whole. The other thing that I see is that the value of artists and their contributions has been recognized and made abundantly clear. George, as you mentioned earlier, it's the having that whole industry sort of close and go away. No live music, no theater, no dance, no art shows. You can go see museums closed down. People began to realize how much that really meant to their lives. And a lot of what was keeping people sane through the pandemic was the arts and what artists were offering them in their living rooms in whatever form. So we saw not only a shift in starting people really recognizing what artists were doing, but here in the Bay Area, we've seen artists being on the front line as what we're calling second responders, leading a lot of the efforts around things like PPE, organizing food banks, organizing community volunteers coming together to help the homeless, really pivoting to being on the front lines of working to help those less fortunate with food, shelter, and other items, even as unemployment for artists in the Bay Area has been anywhere from 65% to 95%, depending on what community you're talking to. So it's been a rough time. I think our advocacy has gotten stronger. We are all in the position right now at Sacramento level, at the city level. We have a new East Bay Arts Advocates group that is advocating for more funding coming out of this CARES Act. We did successfully, from the federal government, get some funding to try and help the arts through COVID that was bigger than the entire national budget for the arts. Usually that comes from the federal government. So we're starting to slowly get people to recognize. And right now, we're making the case that not only do the arts need support for recovery, but that the arts are key to the recovery of the economies and the communities that we're a part of. That when we can open the doors of these arts organizations and put artists back to work, it's putting a lot of money in a lot of other people's pockets as well. So I think we're feeling somewhat optimistic. We've got at the state level a pilot proposal for a WPA-like program, and we're really starting to have more serious conversations happening with public officials all over in a way that I haven't seen in a long, long time. So I'm optimistic that collectively we're stronger than we were before COVID, even though individually so many people are suffering.
Thank you. It's a good message. And how about you? You're on the ground there doing housing as well. So what are some of the good things that have come out of this catastrophe?
Well, I would definitely echo what Catherine said around the degree of organizing, engagement, and advocacy that has really transformed over the last year. And that's both on the side of housing and on the side of sustainability, climate justice, and more specifically in the arts. Wearing any of those hats, I've seen the scale of impact the arts is like it's impossible to overstate. I mean, wearing my artist and designer hat, I saw 27 shows canceled last April, and I had to lay off everybody that worked on projects and shows with me. And there's been a tremendous loss of young artists and sort of culture makers that is really concerning. Sort of how do we make sure that there is not a lost generation of culture? At the same time, what's really inspiring is that there has been so much of coming together of people who were all usually competing for the same little tiny puddle of money and like, oh, well, if you get that show, then that means I didn't get it. This is the moment when we need to actually transform our culture. And that is something that the arts and culture community does. That's like, how do we articulate a new vision for a world that is equitable and is sustainable and that everybody has access to on an equal footing? And we're in a moment where I feel very bit of cautious optimism that might be possible, even though I'm on some level in a trade that does not breed optimism. So at the same time, you have to have this vision of, okay, what does it look like? There's this moment where the arts are not simply an instrumental thing, and it's not sort of an instrumentality to deliver a particular message, but it's actually about transforming how we think and observing what is. And what is actually not that pretty. And you need to see a thing before you can repair and rebuild a thing. So that's my hope. And my sense is also that everyone that I've talked to beyond the arts, in the housing world, broader world, is everybody sees it. And that's actually been the benefit of the pandemic, is going, oh my God, this wasn't actually great before. You know, maybe the good old days weren't quite so good, or they were very good for a very small number of people. And second best, maybe third best. So where do we go from here? And let's just kind of get on with it, really.
If I can underscore what I realized I'd like to underscore, I take for granted. But as we're talking about rebuilding and building back, we're talking about building back better. And because things were so drastically altered, we do have an opportunity in the arts to create much more equitable and differently operating sector and institutions and relationships between artists and publics. So it is scary in some ways because there's so much that was laid waste, but it's actually a moment of enormous possibility. And it's been very exciting to see new leadership coming to the fore during this period.
Thank you, Catherine Ein, for sharing both Vital Arts and the Northern California Community Land Trust's work today. We'll make sure that listeners have your contact information, website, social media, so they can follow both Vital Arts and the Northern California Community Land Trust's work to support artists, families, especially during the COVID-19, which is still going on, and get engaged and support your mission in providing housing and support. So please, both of you, stay safe and healthy out there as we continue to work our way through this very strange new normal.
That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to the voices of the Executive Consultant for Vital Arts, Catherine Reasoner, and the Executive Director of the Northern California Land Trust, Ian Winters. To find out more about Vital Arts and to participate in the Opportunity Loan Fund, go to vitalarts.org. To find out more about the Northern California Land Trust's affordable housing, community facilities, current housing opportunities, the Community Co-Ownership Initiative, and SB 91 Housing Assistance Senate Bill, please go to nclt.org. To hear other voices working with our artist community on a local level, please listen to our interview with Justin and Kareem at Project Artivism in episode 49, and our 1-hour special interview with Joaquin on the San Francisco Office of Economic and Workforce Development's work to support our arts economy in episode 57. On a state level, we hear from Julie of Californians for the Arts in episode 66 about their efforts to secure both funding and political will to help our arts community. Please tune in to KSFP 102.5 FM on July 1st at 8:30 a.m. to listen to next week's show to hear from Miracle Messages about their Miracle Money pilot program to help bring stability to our unhoused community through direct cash transfers and its impact.
We hope that you enjoyed the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the voices of changemakers and their nonprofits and small businesses featured in this series. To find out more and get engaged with the nonprofits, small businesses, and staff members featured in the series, please go to my website, georgecoster.com, and click on Voices of the Community to find links to the extended versions of these interviews and to listen to the entire series. After listening to these stories, we hope that you will consider making a donation and volunteering to provide a hand up to your fellow community members. I want to thank my associate producer, Eric Estrada, and Casey Nance at Citron Studios, along with the wonderful crew at the San Francisco Public Press and KSFP. Voices of the Community is a member of Intersection for the Arts, which allows us to offer you a tax deduction for your contributions. Please go to georgecoster.com and click on the donate link to make a donation to help us provide future shows just like this one. While you're on our website, you can enjoy our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities. And you can sign up for our newsletter to find out more about future shows, as well as shows and events from the organizations that are included in our episodes. Take us along on your next COVID walk by subscribing to Voices of the Community on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at George Coster, and we'd love to hear from you with feedback and show ideas, so send us an email to george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.